Wrong neighborhood, he said. Wrong car. Wrong night. He said it quietly, close enough that only the boy bleeding on the wet asphalt could hear it, his voice carrying the flat, unhurried certainty of a man who has never once been asked to justify a decision he has made. Officer Dale Greer had no idea in that moment that he was delivering his own epitaph. Pembroke County at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night had the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like an agreement. The particular silence of a place that has decided over many years and through many small arrangements exactly who is permitted to be comfortable inside it. The oak trees lining Granger Road stood in rows so deliberate they looked planted by committee, which they had been in 1991, according to a bronze plaque near the neighborhood's entrance that nobody had read in years. The street lamps had been chosen for their amber warmth rather than any practical utility, and the lawns behind their iron fences were maintained with a precision that suggested the real product was not grass, but the message the grass sent to anyone passing through. This was a neighborhood that communicated belonging without ever quite saying the word, and its opposite without ever saying that word either. A 19-year-old boy was driving south on Granger Road in a borrowed car, thinking about his biochemistry exam and whether the leftovers in his refrigerator had been there 4 days or 5, and he had no idea that someone parked in the dark at the mouth of a cul-de-sac had already decided everything about him from the distance of a pair of headlights. By the time the sun came up over Pembroke County, everything Dale Greer had spent 18 years building, his badge, his career, his freedom, and the entire architecture of protection that had allowed him to operate without consequence, would be gone. This is the story of the phone call that ended a precinct. Jordan Ellison had driven Granger Road 11 times before tonight, and he knew its rhythms the way you know a shortcut, not with affection, but with the functional knowledge of someone who has decided that this particular path shaves 12 minutes off a drive that already feels too long at the end of a 6-hour shift at the free clinic downtown. He was 19 years old, a pre-med sophomore at Caldwell State University, carrying a 3.88 GPA through the kind of grinding effort that looked effortless from the outside and felt like running uphill in wet shoes from the inside. And tonight, he had spent 6 hours at the East Side Community Health Clinic doing the work that nobody photographed and nobody put in a press release. The work that was just the work. He had helped an elderly diabetic man named Walter who had walked 2 miles in shoes that were a full size too small because he hadn't wanted to spend the bus fare Jordan had cleaned and dressed the blisters on both feet and arranged for a follow-up that Walter had previously been unable to schedule because he couldn't navigate the phone system the county used. He had sat with a teenage girl named Priya, who had been too ashamed to describe her symptoms clearly to the nurse, and had needed someone to sit beside her and translate not language but fear into something the medical staff could work with. He had spent 40 minutes with a father whose adult son had been discharged from the county hospital 2 days too early. The father standing in the clinic hallway holding a discharge paper. He didn't fully understand asking questions. Nobody at the hospital had stayed long enough to answer. Jordan answered every one of them. He did this not for the resume credit, though it helped, and not because anyone required it of him, but because his mother had spent most of his childhood in county hospital waiting rooms where the chairs were bolted to the floor, and nobody looked at you like they were in a hurry to help. He had decided at 14 that he was going to become a doctor, and he had decided with a conviction that sometimes surprised even him in its completeness, that medicine was only meaningful if it reached the people who couldn't reach it on their own. That was not a philosophy he had read somewhere. It was something he had watched his mother need and nobody provide, and he had decided to be the provision. The passenger seat of the borrowed Buick held the evidence of his day in the specific disorder of a life lived in motion. A battered anatomy textbook with a blue latex surgical glove tucked between pages as a bookmark, a granola bar with 2 bites taken out of it, his Caldwell State lanyard coiled on top of everything. The car itself was his Uncle Bernard's, a 2007 Buick LeSabre with a dented rear door and a check engine light that Bernard had been meaning to address for somewhere between 3 and 14 months, depending on who was telling the story. Jordan's father had offered him a newer car many times. "Take the Accord. It's just sitting there. You need something that won't leave you on the side of a highway." And Jordan had declined each time with a patience that occasionally frustrated Raymond, and that Raymond, if he was honest with himself, also understood completely. It wasn't stubbornness. It was a belief harder to articulate than it was to feel that the kind of doctor he intended to become needed to stay tethered to ordinary struggle, needed to move through the world in contact with its friction, because the moment you begin traveling in something that announces your distance from difficulty, something necessary and irreplaceable begins to quietly slip away. Jordan had watched physicians lose that thing over the years, could identify the precise moment when a doctor stopped seeing a patient and started seeing a case, and he had decided that whatever it cost him to stay connected, he would pay it. In the glove compartment of the Buick, beneath a small flashlight and 2 expired insurance cards from the previous owner, was a manila envelope that Bernard had put there sometime in the past year. Bernard wrote everything in block capitals, large and deliberate, because he said it was easier to read in bad light, and across the front of the envelope in black marker were the words registration/insurance, the letters wide enough to be read across a room. Jordan had noticed the envelope when he borrowed the car and had not thought about it again because there was no reason to. It was exactly what it said it was. It was a registration envelope sitting in a glove compartment exactly where registration envelopes are supposed to sit in a borrowed car driven by a 19-year-old boy who had spent the evening helping people who needed help, and who was now driving home along a familiar road, thinking about biochemistry and leftovers, and absolutely nothing else. The radio was playing something low and instrumental, jazz drifting in and out of signal clarity depending on how many trees stood between the antenna and the tower. Jordan turned it down rather than let it crackle into static. He rounded the curve before the Granger-Whitfield intersection, passed under the broken signal light that had been blinking amber for 3 years because the county and the township couldn't agree on who was responsible for fixing it, and continued south. He did not know that someone was already watching him. He did not know that a calculation had already been completed. He did not know that the envelope in the glove compartment, written in block capitals so it could be read in bad light, was about to be called something that it was not by a man who had made that kind of decision 18 years' worth of times and had never once been asked to answer for it. He turned the radio down a little further. 17 minutes from home. Officer Dale Greer had been with the Pembroke County Sheriff's Department for 18 years, 4 months, and he had been known to calculate the days allowed in the break room not out of pride exactly, but out of the particular satisfaction of a man who experiences tenure as a form of ownership. 18 years of this road, this county, this precinct, and the accumulated sense that he understood it in ways that newer officers simply could not access. He was parked at the entrance of a cul-de-sac off Granger Road, nose pointed toward the street engine idling interior lights off the cruiser, partially screened by a privacy hedge that had been allowed to grow well past the property line. Greer had noted the overgrowth as a potential violation 2 years ago and had deliberately never cited it because the hedge made this corner useful. From this position, he could observe 300 yards of Granger Road without being observed himself, and over 18 years he had developed a very clear sense of what that observation was for. Greer was not unintelligent. In many ways he was more dangerous for not being unintelligent. He understood optics. He knew the language of procedure well enough to weaponize it had learned long ago that prejudice in a modern law enforcement environment needed to wear the costume of professional instinct, of street knowledge, of pattern recognition. Never the raw, unvarnished face it actually wore in the parts of his mind where the real decisions were made. He had 16 complaints filed against him with the department's internal review board over 18 years, ranging from excessive force to racially motivated stops, and every single one of those complaints had been closed without disciplinary action. This was not an accident. It was a maintenance project quietly administered by his commanding officer, Captain Roy Lester, who had understood for 11 years that certain officers were more useful when they remained unconstrained by accountability. Greer's hair was the pale, faded blonde of a man who had been very blonde at 20 and was now 47, and his eyes in the dark of the cruiser were the specific gray of someone who has spent nearly 2 decades perfecting the art of looking at people and seeing only what he has already decided to see. He did not think of himself as a prejudiced man. He experienced himself as the last honest practitioner of something the department had become too careful to name a man who knew his territory and trusted his instincts in a way that younger, more cautious officers had been trained out of. This belief intact and unexamined after 18 years was what made him genuinely dangerous in a way that simple cruelty never quite manages to be. Beside him in the driver's seat sat Officer Scott Vance, 25 years old, 8 months on the job, still technically in his field training period. Vance had a photograph of himself and Greer at the department's summer cookout taped inside his locker. He had sent a copy of the photograph to his mother, who had framed it. He was not a cruel person in any instinctive sense, but he had spent 8 months building his entire professional identity around Dale Greer's approval, learning to read Greer's silences as instruction learning to substitute Greer's assessment of a situation for his own perception, because the implicit lesson of every shift they had shared was that Greer's read was always the correct one, and that hesitation was a form of weakness. He had not yet built the internal scaffolding, the independent judgment, the personal standard that would allow him to say no when the man beside him nodded. He was not sure yet that saying no was something real police officers did. At 11:14 p.m., the headlights of a Buick LeSabre appeared at the north end of Granger Road. Greer set down his coffee. It was a small gesture almost imperceptible in the dark, but Vance felt the shift in the car the way you feel air pressure change before weather, and he sat up slightly without knowing he had done it. The Buick rolled south at 28 miles per hour in a 30 zone. It came to a complete clean stop at the Granger-Whitfield intersection, full stop, behind the line a full 2 seconds. Both directions checked before it continued south. Greer watched it pass. His eyes didn't follow the car so much as absorb it, run it through the private algorithm he had built over 18 years and never once spoken aloud in its actual language. Old car, dented rear door, young black driver alone. After 11 at night. No apparent reason to be in Pembroke Heights. He said none of this. Instead, he said, "Check the right rear tire." Vance looked at the data terminal on the dashboard. What about it? Cross the fog line at the intersection. Failure to maintain lane. Greer was already putting the cruiser in drive. Vance looked through the windshield at the Buick 40 yards ahead, perfectly centered in its lane. He had been watching the entire time. The tire had not crossed any line. He had seen the stop. He had seen the turn. He opened his mouth. Greer looked at him. Just that. No words. Just the weight of 18 years and 16 buried complaints and the particular look of a man who has never once in nearly 2 decades been made to answer for a decision he has made. Vance looked back at the road. Greer hit the lights. The 16 complaints against Dale Greer were not a secret inside the Pembroke County Sheriff's Department. They existed in a file that anyone with the appropriate access could pull, and several people had pulled it over the years, a union representative during a brief contract dispute, a department attorney preparing for a civil lawsuit that was eventually settled quietly, an investigator from the county's Civilian Oversight Board who had submitted a recommendation for formal review in 2019 and received no response. The file existed. The complaints existed. The documentation of what Greer had been doing for 18 years on the roads of Pembroke County existed in the system clearly labeled organized by date, available to anyone who cared to look carefully enough. Nobody had looked carefully enough. The reason for this had a name: Captain Roy Lester Greer's commanding officer for 11 of those 18 years. A man with a firm handshake and a clear blue gaze and the specific practiced ease of someone who has spent a long career learning to be the kind of authority figure that nobody wants to disagree with. Lester had not built his protection of Greer out of any particular personal affection. They were not close friends, did not socialize outside the department, but out of a calculation that was both simpler and more corrosive than friendship. Greer closed cases. Greer's arrests held up because Greer understood procedure well enough to paper his stops with just enough technical language to survive review. Greer's conviction rate was the highest in the department for 4 consecutive years, and in a county where the metrics that mattered to elected officials were conviction rates and arrest numbers, and the perception of a department that was on top of things. Greer was an asset. Lester had learned to experience the complaints as the cost of the asset's productivity, and he had managed that cost by closing every complaint without action, and never asking the question that the complaints collectively and clearly were asking. Greer had in this environment developed something more dangerous than simple confidence. He had developed the certainty of a man who has been tested and passed every test, and who has therefore concluded that the tests were designed to confirm what he already knew about himself. In 18 years, not a single consequence had reached him. Not a single formal finding, not a single suspension, not a single documented acknowledgement that any of the 16 people who had filed complaints against him had experienced anything other than proper professional law enforcement. This record blank of consequence, dense with closed files, had done something to Greer's understanding of what was possible for him that went deeper than arrogance. It had restructured his sense of reality. He did not believe he was above the rules because he was arrogant. He believed he was above the rules because the rules in 18 years of actual practice had never applied to him. 3 of the 16 complaints had been filed by individuals who later appeared in Pembroke County court records as defendants, people who had been charged in the months following their complaints against Greer with offenses that on closer review rested almost entirely on Greer's own testimony about probable cause with no corroborating evidence, no independent witness, no physical documentation beyond what Greer himself had produced. A young man named Devin, who had filed a complaint about an unlawful stop in 2018, was convicted the following year of possession, based on evidence found during a search that Greer initiated, and that Devin's public defender lacked the time and resources to challenge effectively. A woman named Camille, who had filed a complaint about excessive force in 2020, found herself 3 months later facing a charge of obstructing a law enforcement officer, a charge that was eventually dropped, but not before she had spent 11 days in county lockup and lost the job she had held for 4 years. These were not anomalies. They were the shape of a pattern visible to anyone who looked at the file with the specific intention of seeing what was there, rather than confirming what they had already decided was there. Nobody in 18 years had looked at the file with that intention. Tonight, for the first time, someone was going to. Jordan was 13 years old the afternoon his father sat him down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a black pen and delivered what Jordan would later come to think of as the briefing. Not a conversation, not a talk, not the kind of gentle parental guidance that arrived, wrapped in reassurance and cushioned with qualifications, but a briefing systematic and precise, the way Raymond Ellison approached every serious thing in his life. Raymond was a federal prosecutor at the time, 12 years into a career that had been built on the specific skill of making complex truths legible to people who needed to understand them clearly and quickly, and he brought that skill to the kitchen table with a completeness that meant he was not performing calm. He was producing it deliberately, because he had decided that what his son needed in that moment was clarity rather than fear, and that the only way to give him clarity without giving him fear was to treat the subject the way he treated evidence as a set of facts that required preparation, not panic. He told Jordan that there were situations where being right was not sufficient protection, where doing nothing wrong offered no guarantee of safety, where the correct response to injustice was not to contest it in the moment, but to survive the moment, so that the injustice could be contested afterward in a venue designed for that purpose by people with the tools to address it. He told him this without apology and without softening, because Jordan was 13, and Raymond believed that the kindest thing you could offer a young black man navigating this country was accuracy. Then he went through the protocol point by point in the order that mattered. Windows down before the officer reaches the car so that nothing about your hands is ambiguous. Dome light on so that the interior of the vehicle is visible and readable. Both hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, completely still before the officer arrives at your window. Announce every movement before you make it say what you are about to do before you do it every time. Without exception, even if it seems unnecessary, even if it seems excessive, even if the officer hasn't asked. Ask permission before reaching for anything. Comply even when they are wrong, even when it is unjust, even when every instinct in your body is telling you that this is not how this should go. The street is not the courtroom. Survive the street. I will handle the rest. Raymond's voice during this was level and steady, the voice he used in a courtroom when the stakes were highest and the steadiness was most necessary. His hands on the yellow legal pad were not entirely steady, and Jordan, 13 years old, noticing everything. The way children notice the things adults believe they are concealing. Saw the slight tremor in his father's right hand as Raymond wrote each point in his clear, careful handwriting. Jordan didn't fully understand at 13 why his father's hand was not quite still. He understood the words. He understood the logic. He even understood in the abstract way that a 13-year-old understands things that haven't yet happened to him, that the protocol was a response to something real and not hypothetical. But he didn't understand the tremor until later. He understood it completely at 19 on the shoulder of Granger Road with the red and blue lights of a patrol car filling his mirrors and his heart hammering in his chest in the specific way of a fear that does not respond to reason because it was never rooted in reason. It was rooted in knowing. In years of watching what happened to people who hadn't been prepared in the voice of a father who had written a survival guide for his son on a yellow legal pad and had not been entirely steady while doing it. Jordan activated his turn signal. He pulled smoothly onto the wide shoulder beneath a street lamp. He killed the engine. He turned off the radio, cutting the jazz mid-note. He pressed all 4 window buttons simultaneously. He reached up and switched on the interior dome light. He placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the top of the steering wheel, and he did not move them. Behind him, the cruiser's door opened and boots hit the wet asphalt with the deliberate, unhurried sound of a man performing a ritual he has performed so many times it has become ceremony. Greer adjusted his utility belt. He took his time. In the passenger seat, Vance unclipped his flashlight and climbed out on the other side, and for one fraction of a second, standing at the rear of the cruiser with the Focus's 4 open windows visible and the dome light glowing warm inside the car, Vance felt something tighten in his chest that was not excitement and that he didn't have a name for yet. He followed his partner toward the car. Greer reached the driver's window and directed the beam of his flashlight directly into Jordan's eyes, not sweeping the interior for any assessment of what was there, not checking Jordan's hands or the back seat, or any of the things that the beam of a flashlight is professionally supposed to illuminate. Straight into his eyes, full intensity, close range the flashlight held as a statement rather than a tool, a way of reminding the person behind it what they were looking at. Jordan turned his face a few degrees away from the beam but kept his hands completely still on the wheel. License, registration, and proof of insurance, Greer said. No greeting. No identification of himself. No explanation for the stop. No, the reason I pulled you over. Just the demand delivered flat and fast in the particular register of someone who has decided that the person they are speaking to is not owed an explanation. Good evening, officer. Jordan's voice was clear and level, the voice of someone who has rehearsed this exchange in his head hundreds of times, and for whom the rehearsal has now become something he is actively grateful for, a structure to hold on to in the absence of solid ground. My license is in my wallet right rear pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'll need to reach for both. Is that all right? Greer leaned slightly closer to the open window. The smell of stale coffee and something that had been left too long in an enclosed space entered the car. He was studying Jordan's face with an expression that contained no curiosity and no professional assessment, only the specific inventory of a man deciding what something is worth. The calm bothered him. In 18 years of stops on this road, nervousness had been his natural due. The fidgeting, the over-explanation, the trembling that confirmed the badge was working the way it was supposed to work. Calmness read to Greer, not as innocence, never as that, but as defiance, as the particular kind of composure that represented a challenge to the order of things he had spent nearly 2 decades establishing on these roads. He could not have explained this logic if anyone had pressed him on it, which nobody ever had. "Get your papers," Greer said. "Yes, sir." Jordan moved his right hand from the wheel with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial, announcing the motion with his body, before his arm moved and reached for the glove compartment. The compartment opened. Inside was the organized disorder of a borrowed vehicle: old service receipts, a small flashlight with a dead battery, a travel-size hand sanitizer, 2 pens without caps, and beneath everything at the back of the compartment, the manila envelope in his Uncle Bernard's block capitals, registration/insurance. The letters wide and deliberate and completely unambiguously readable, written by a man who had put them there for exactly this kind of moment, so that even in bad light, even in the compressed uncertainty of a roadside stop, what the envelope contained would be unmistakable. Jordan's hand moved toward it. On the passenger side of the car, Vance saw the movement in the shadows of the compartment. Vance saw Jordan's hand moving in the shadows of the open compartment, and he saw the envelope. The block capital handwriting, the word registration, visible against the manila background. And in the approximately 1.5 seconds that followed, he experienced something that he would spend years attempting to accurately describe to himself and to others, and that no description he ever produced quite captured. He knew what it was. He saw the envelope and he read the word, and he knew in the part of his mind that had not yet been fully replaced by 8 months of apprenticeship to Dale Greer, that it was exactly what it said. It was a registration envelope in a glove compartment. The most ordinary object in the most ordinary location. Nothing. He knew this. And then he looked across the roof of the car at Greer, who was standing at the driver's window, and Greer gave him the nod. It was a millimeter of motion, a minimal inclination of the head barely visible in the amber light of the street lamp. Greer had developed this vocabulary over years of training new officers, a system of small gestures that communicated authorization and instruction without words, without anything that could be captured on audio or described in a complaint. The nod meant act on what you think you see. The nod meant I'm behind you. The nod meant in the specific language of 8 months of accumulated conditioning, your hesitation is weakness, and I am telling you to move past it. Vance moved past it. Weapon, he screamed. He's reaching weapon. What happened next took less than 4 seconds and would require a jury nearly 2 hours to fully process. Greer did not pause. He did not look again into the vehicle to assess whether what Vance had called was actually there. He acted on the word, on the volume of it, on 18 years of practiced justification that had long since fused into something that felt indistinguishable from instinct, but was in every meaningful sense something far more deliberate. He lunged. His arm came through the open window, fist closing around the collar and shoulder of Jordan's sweatshirt. Simultaneously, the fabric twisting against his throat, and his other hand found the door handle from the inside and pulled it hard, and he put his full body weight into a twisting heave that dragged Jordan Ellison out of the driver's seat and through the open door in one continuous violent motion. The asphalt of the Granger Road shoulder was cold and slick from rain that had passed through 2 hours earlier. Jordan hit it shoulder first, and then the left side of his face came down against the pavement with a sound that a physician would later describe in careful clinical notes as consistent with a hairline fracture of the jaw. Pain exploded up the entire left side of his body in a white electric wave that temporarily reorganized everything's sound vision sense of position into something that didn't correspond to normal experience. His father's voice arrived in the same instant, arriving not as memory, but as physical instruction embedded so deeply into his nervous system that it cut through the agony and the disorientation with the authority of something that had been learned before the body knew fear. Do not fight back. Hands flat. Survive the street. I am not resisting, Jordan said. He got the words out even through the impact, even through the white noise of pain, because those words had been rehearsed 10,000 times in exactly the voice he was using now. Level, clear, deliberate, directed not at Greer, but at the night air and anyone in it who might be listening. He rolled onto his stomach, both palms flat on the wet asphalt, legs spread wide. He made his body as open and unambiguous as a body can be. Vance came around the rear of the car at a run. Vance came around the rear of the Buick at a full run and drove his knee into the center of Jordan's back with the full momentum of his sprint, forcing every cubic inch of air out of Jordan's lungs in a single compressed rush that left him unable for a long, terrible moment to draw another breath. Jordan's vision went white at the edges. He heard himself make a sound he did not recognize as his own voice. "Stop moving," Greer was shouting from above him. "Stop resisting." Jordan was not moving. His hands were flat on the ground. His legs were still spread. The only motion in his body was the involuntary shudder of someone trying to reinflate a chest that has been forcibly emptied, and that motion was not within his control to stop, and it did not resemble resistance in any way that a person looking at it with honest eyes could have characterized as resistance. Greer's fist came down on the right side of Jordan's ribcage, a full closed fist strike, deliberately aimed the punch of a man who has done this before and knows exactly where to land it for maximum effect. Something in Jordan's side responded in a way that sent nauseating, radiating pain outward in every direction, and Jordan understood in that moment with a clarity that cut through everything else that something had either fractured or come very close to it. Inside the locked vault of his own mind, behind the pain and the weight and the cold, wet asphalt against his cheek and the sound of Greer's voice calling him something he was not, Jordan did something that would later strike everyone who heard about it as almost impossibly disciplined for a 19-year-old boy in that position. He pressed his fingernails into the heel of his left palm until the pain was sharp and local, and entirely his not self-punishment, but an anchor, a fixed point of sensation that he controlled in the middle of chaos. He had not chosen a way of staying present when everything around him was designed to take him somewhere he could not afford to go. "Stay here. Hands flat. Stay present. I will handle the rest." Greer unclipped the taser from his belt. "Last warning," he said. The warning was theater. Jordan was pinned compliant and motionless, and the warning was not directed at any genuine threat. It was directed at the record, at the language of the incident report that was already being drafted in Greer's mind. The careful, procedural grammar that had protected him 16 times before, and that he had every reason to believe would protect him again. He pressed the muzzle of the taser against the back of Jordan's left thigh and pulled the trigger. The electrical current traveled through Jordan's nervous system in a wave that was beyond pain. In the conventional sense, a total involuntary commandeering of every muscle in the affected area, all of them contracting simultaneously and without permission, the body betraying itself in a way that the mind could neither negotiate with nor override. Jordan's legs seized. His back arched. A sound came out of him that was not a scream so much as what the human body produces when it is processing something entirely outside the normal parameters of experience. Vance, seeing the convulsion, the physics-mandated device-caused convulsion, that was the mechanical result of what Greer had just done, called it resistance and delivered 2 heavy strikes to the back of Jordan's head. The world broke into pieces, high-pitched ringing, cold asphalt against his cheekbone, the metallic taste of blood from a tongue bitten when he hit the ground. Then the steel bite of handcuffs applied so tightly that the circulation to both hands was cut within seconds, deep purple marking itself against his wrists within minutes. Greer hauled him upright by the chain between the cuffs. Jordan's knees nearly gave way. A gash above his left eye had opened when his face struck the asphalt, and it was bleeding freely down the left side of his face, dripping from his jaw and staining the collar of his gray sweatshirt in a spreading, darkening bloom. Greer leaned in close. There was no performance required out here in the dark, no camera rolling that he was aware of, no reason to be anything other than what he was. "Wrong neighborhood," he said. Wrong car. Wrong night. Jordan looked back at him through the one eye that was still fully open and said nothing. He was still alive. His hands, even inside the cuffs, were still as open as they could be. He had not given them what they wanted. Across the road, a passing car had slowed nearly to a stop. The driver had a phone raised. Greer turned his head, fixed the driver with a long, flat look, and lifted his badge. The car accelerated and disappeared into the dark. He shoved Jordan toward the cruiser. The Pembroke County Sheriff's Substation had been built in the 1970s by someone who believed that civic authority should be communicated through aggressive concrete and the deliberate absence of windows, and 4 decades had done nothing to soften this philosophy. It smelled of floor wax and old coffee, and the particular staleness that accumulates in any space where people are processed rather than helped, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed at a frequency too low to consciously register, but too constant to entirely ignore the sound of a system that has been running a long time without being examined. It was 11:52 p.m. when Greer and Vance walked Jordan through the double doors into the booking area. Jordan could barely maintain a straight line. His left leg was dragging slightly from the taser's aftermath, the neuromuscular interference that the device causes and that takes the body time to unwind, and the right side of his face had begun to swell into something that would be spectacular by morning, deep purple and black at the cheekbone, the eye beneath it narrowing toward shut. The gash above his left eye had slowed but not stopped bleeding, and a rough paper towel had been pressed against it at some point during the drive, and had now dried partly and adhered to the wound in a way that would require medical attention to remove. His sweatshirt was torn at the collar and dark with both road water and blood. Behind the elevated booking desk sat Sergeant Pete Dunbar, 56 years old, 20 years with the department, the last 9 in this specific chair at this specific desk. He was not a cruel man. He was something that in certain conditions can produce cruelty without any cruelty being present. A man who had learned over 2 decades of desk work to process the paperwork in front of him without asking questions about the paperwork behind it. He looked up when the double doors swung open and his face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Recognition, practiced blankness, and then something else that he suppressed almost immediately, but that would return to him with increasing insistence in the hours that followed. Greer delivered the charges in his flat professional tone, resisting a law enforcement officer assault on an officer failure to comply and possible stolen vehicle pending VIN confirmation. He stated these charges the way he wrote incident reports with enough technical language to survive review clean and efficient and entirely disconnected from what had actually happened on the shoulder of Granger Road. Vance said nothing. He had not spoken since the roadside. His silence was not the silence of a man at peace with what had occurred. Jordan straightened against the booking railing and looked at Dunbar through his one functioning eye. "That is not what happened," he said, and his voice, though rough and raw from the effort of the past 45 minutes, was steady in a way that seemed to cost him something to maintain. "I was compliant from the moment the lights came on. I did everything I was asked and more. I announced every movement. I asked permission before I reached for anything. They removed me from the car without cause, and they struck me while I was flat on the ground with my hands open." "Shut your mouth," Greer said, and hit the back of Jordan's head with a flat, open palm slap. Dunbar said, "Hey." He said it the way a man says it when he is objecting on behalf of the overhead security camera and not on behalf of any principal he is currently willing to name. Then he began to type. He ran the name Jordan A. Ellison through the warrant system. The warrant check came back completely clean. He noted it and reached for the evidence log. "You get 1 call," Dunbar said, not unkindly. He pointed at the wall-mounted metal phone at the far end of the booking desk. "Make it." Greer crossed his arms against the counter. "Public defender won't be in till Thursday," he said with the easy satisfaction of a man who considers this amusing. "If you're lucky." Jordan walked to the phone. His hands, free of the cuffs now, were shaking not with fear, but with the specific tremor of hands that have had their circulation cut off for a sustained period, and are in the process of re-establishing contact with the nervous system, the slow, uncomfortable return of sensation to fingers that have been denied it. The cuff marks were visible across both wrists. From across the room, deep purple lines pressed into the skin that would still be visible in photographs taken 3 days later. He flexed his hands slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you are trying to confirm that the parts of your body you need are still responding. He picked up the receiver. One number. No hesitation. He had known it since he was 13 years old. A direct line, no voicemail, no executive assistant, no front desk, no automated message asking him to select from a list of options. A number his father had made him memorize on the same afternoon he had made him memorize the protocol in the same careful, unhurried voice, impressing it into him not as something he might need someday, but as something he would carry with him always, the way you carry the knowledge of your own address. He punched in the 10 digits one by one, bending slightly toward the keypad, the blood from the gash above his left eye beginning to track again across his cheek as he leaned forward. The phone rang once. Twice. On the third ring, the call connected. The voice that answered was thick with interrupted sleep and became sharp within the first syllable. Not hello, not yes, just the last name, stated with the finality of a door opened by someone who was already halfway through it. Ellison. Jordan closed his eyes. Just for a moment. He found the center of himself, the place his father had taught him existed in every person. The place that panic couldn't quite reach if you had been shown where to look for it. And he breathed once, and then he said, Dad, it's me. On the other end of the line, in a bedroom at the state capitol 108 miles away, Raymond Ellison sat up. Not gradually, not the slow surfacing of a man waking from deep sleep, but all at once the way a prosecutor sits up when the evidence changes, the full immediate presence of a man whose mind has been processing information for 30 years and does not require a warm-up period. He heard his son's voice. He did not just hear the words, he heard the frequency beneath them, the specific texture of air around a person who is working very hard at something, the sound of controlled, deliberate calm being maintained at significant cost. In 30 years of reading people for a living, he had never been wrong about that sound, and he had been dreading hearing it in this particular voice since the afternoon at the kitchen table with the yellow legal pad. Jordan told him everything in the order that mattered, where he was, what had happened, that he had done everything exactly as instructed. Hands at 10 and 2 announced every movement, asked permission, did not resist, did not argue, complied with everything. Gave them nothing that could be used against him. And then, quietly, in the slight drop of his voice that Raymond had been listening for from the first syllable, They hurt me, Dad. They beat me. They used the taser. The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds. It was not the silence of shock. Raymond Ellison had been the state's attorney general for 6 years, a federal prosecutor for 12 years before that, and a young black man navigating this country for 30 years before any of those titles existed. The silence was not surprise. It was the sound of a weapon being loaded with complete methodical precision. Names, Raymond said. His voice had dropped an octave, and it was no longer the voice of a father startled from sleep. Greer and Vance Jordan said, I'm coming, Raymond said. The line clicked. At the booking desk, Pete Dunbar had moved through the standard processing steps, with the practiced efficiency of a man who has done this 9,000 times, and he had arrived at the routine next of kin notification check, a process the department had added to its intake protocol after a lawsuit 3 years prior, involving a minor who had been processed overnight without any family contact, and he typed the name into the secondary state database, the way he typed everything without anticipation, without any particular expectation of what he was about to find. He clicked search. The screen refreshed. He read what was there. He read it a second time more slowly with the particular deliberateness of a man who suspects his eyes may have made an error that his brain has not yet corrected. His pen dropped from his fingers. It hit the surface of the desk with a small plastic sound that was in the midnight silence of the booking area surprisingly almost comically loud. Dunbar did not reach to pick it up. He was staring at the screen. Next of kin/parent, Raymond. A. Ellison. Title State Attorney General. Office Executive Building, State Capitol. Dunbar sat very still for a moment. At the wall phone, Jordan lowered the receiver slightly from his ear and said in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly across the room, "My father would like to speak with whoever is in charge." Greer pushed off the counter with the easy confidence of a man who considers this a manageable inconvenience and crossed the room with the unhurried swagger he brought to every interaction where he held structural authority. He took the receiver from Jordan's hand and put it to his ear. "Yeah," he said. He leaned one shoulder against the wall ankles, crossed the physical language of a man who owns the space he occupies and has no particular concern about anyone challenging that ownership. "Who's this?" What happened to Dale Greer's face over the next 45 seconds was not dramatic. It was something quieter, and for that reason more complete, the specific collapse of a structure from which the foundation has been removed. The surface holding for a moment while the weight of everything above it slowly inevitably finds the ground. His ankles uncrossed first. Then he straightened from the wall. Then his free hand, which had been hooked loosely in his vest, dropped to his side. His jaw set. His eyes went somewhere that was not the room he was standing in. Raymond Ellison was speaking. He was not shouting. He was not issuing threats in any language that could be characterized as intemperate. He was stating facts in order with the calm precision of a man who has spent 3 decades understanding that hysteria is the luxury of people who don't actually hold power. He gave his full name and title. He stated that the State Bureau of Investigation would be arriving at the Pembroke County substation within the hour. He stated that the facility's evidence systems and server infrastructure would be secured. He stated that he wanted the highest-ranking officer currently on duty on the line within 30 seconds. And he said all of it in a voice that never rose above the volume of a normal conversation, and that was for exactly that reason, the most unsettling thing Dale Greer had heard in 18 years of doing whatever he wanted. "Look," Greer said, "your son resisted." 30 seconds, Officer Greer, Raymond said. Across the booking area, Pete Dunbar had not moved from his desk. He was looking at the screen. He was looking at Jordan standing beside the wall phone with one eye swollen nearly shut and blood tracking down his cheek and cuff marks still visible on both wrists. He was thinking for the first time in 9 years of watching Greer bring people through that door about all the others, all the people who had stood in that exact spot, all the paperwork he had processed without asking the question, that the paperwork should have prompted all the closed files and clean sheets and the things that a man tells himself about what his job requires and what it does not. He thought about this for exactly as long as he needed to. Then he stood up from his desk, walked across the room, and took the phone from Dale Greer's hand. Greer froze. In 18 years, nobody at this substation had done that. Not once. Vance, standing near the far wall, looked at Greer's face and then looked at the computer screen which he could now read from where he was standing. He saw the name. He saw the title. A sound escaped him, not a word. Just the involuntary exhale of someone whose entire professional foundation has been revealed in a single moment to have been built on nothing at all. Dunbar pressed the receiver to his ear. His hand was shaking not with fear, but with the specific tremor of a man doing something necessary that frightens him, something he should have done a long time ago and is only now finding his way to. "Sergeant Pete Dunbar," he said. "Desk sergeant on duty, sir." They came without sirens, and the absence of sound was somehow more alarming than any sound would have been 4 dark Chevrolet Suburbans, with State Bureau of Investigation markings on the doors, moving in tight coordinated formation down Pembroke County's main street at 12:38 a.m., stopping in front of the substation with the kind of precise simultaneous positioning that comes from units that rehearse this movement. All 4 sets of doors opened in the same motion. 12 agents stepped out wearing SBI tactical vests and moved without urgency, not rushing, not running, simply filling space the way water fills a container, moving around obstacles without friction, establishing a presence that required no announcement, because presence was the announcement. The last person to exit the lead vehicle was not wearing tactical gear. Raymond Ellison, State Attorney General, was wearing a charcoal trench coat over a white dress shirt with a tie knotted by muscle memory at what must have been 12:15 in the morning, and he was 58 years old and 6 feet 1 inch tall, and he carried the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent their lives in rooms where everything depends on what they do next. He walked through the double doors of the substation without breaking stride, and the booking area went immediately still. His eyes moved across the room the way his mind always moved rapidly, completely gathering everything at once. They swept past Greer standing near the counter, past Vance near the far wall with his hands at his sides and nowhere to put them, past Dunbar back at his desk sitting very straight, past the overhead security camera, past the door to the evidence storage room. And then they landed in the far corner near the medical supply cabinet, where Jordan Ellison was sitting in a hard plastic booking chair, while a paramedic called by Dunbar 13 minutes ago, the first useful thing Dunbar had done all night, cleaned the laceration above his left eye with careful, practiced hands. The boy's face was swollen on both sides now. His lips were split. He was holding his right arm slightly against his rib cage, a posture he had unconsciously adopted to reduce the pain of breathing, the specific accommodation of a body managing something broken or close to broken. His sweatshirt was ruined. His wrists were still marked. He had not looked up when the doors opened. For a fraction of a second, a fraction that no one in the room was meant to see but that everyone saw anyway, because it was not something that could be contained, the Attorney General was gone. What was in the room, briefly, was just a father. Raymond crossed the floor in 4 strides and went to one knee beside the chair. He did not speak immediately. He looked at his son's face with the focused, complete attention of a man who has spent 30 years being the last person in any room to show what he feels and who is right now failing at that. He looked at the swollen eye, the dried blood that had tracked down along the jaw. The paper towel adhered to the wound above the eyebrow. The specific, exhausted set of a young man who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has not yet been given permission to put it down. He placed his hand on Jordan's shoulder. Under his palm, through the ruined fabric of the sweatshirt, Raymond could feel that his son was shaking. Not visibly, Jordan was holding himself with the same trained stillness he had held on the shoulder of Granger Road, but the deep internal tremor was there. The vibration of a body that has absorbed too much and has not yet been told it can stop absorbing. "You're okay," Raymond said. It was the only sentence he trusted himself to produce. "Yeah," Jordan said. And then, in a voice that was almost nothing, Dad. Just the word. 1 syllable. But Raymond heard inside it everything the protocol had cost his son to perform every second of lying face down on wet asphalt with his palms flat and his cheek against the pavement, and 2 men on his back, choosing survival over the rage that had every right to be there. He heard the 13-year-old at the kitchen table. He heard his own hand not quite steady on the yellow legal pad. He stood up. He confirmed with the paramedic that Jordan was stable for hospital transport and arranged for an SBI security detail to accompany the ambulance. He watched as the gurney was brought in and his son was helped onto it, and he watched the doors close behind it. Then he turned back to the room. The father was gone completely, replaced by something that was not anger in the explosive sense, but was colder and more precise than anger, the specific resolve of a man who has spent 3 decades learning exactly where every bolt is holding tools he has been building toward for 30 years and intending to use all of them. He turned to the SBI director. "Lock the building," he said. "Secure every frame of footage from the patrol car, dash cam, body cam, interior audio within the next 8 minutes. He turned to Dunbar. "Your commanding officer, where is he?" Captain Roy Lester came through the rear office door, pulling his uniform jacket over a coffee-stained undershirt, his face wearing the specific belligerence of a man who leads with offense because he has learned that offense is the most effective form of defense. He started to say something. Raymond said his name. Just his name, just 2 words, and it landed in the room like a door being closed. "You are relieved of your command, Captain Lester. Step aside, or you will be placed under arrest for obstruction of justice." Lester's mouth stopped working. He looked at the SBI agents, now positioned throughout his substation, at the agents who had simply been there when he came through the door, filling space, requiring nothing from him, and he took 1 step back. It was the most consequential step of his career. He didn't know it yet, but he would. The evidence room at the Pembroke County substation was small and gray, and lit by a single overhead fixture that buzzed with the same frequency as the lights in the booking area, as though the entire building ran on the same tired current. The SBI director had set up a secured laptop and portable monitor on the single table, and Raymond Ellison stood at that table with 2 senior investigators, while the technician pulled the data directly from the patrol car's onboard recording system. "No modification attempts," the technician said. "Drive is intact. They didn't have time." The footage began from the moment the patrol car pulled out of the cul-de-sac off Granger Road, and the audio inside the cruiser came first. Greer's voice, private and unhurried. The voice of a man who believed with complete confidence that what he was saying would never be heard by anyone who mattered. The Buick visible through the windshield in the distance. Greer's assessment: old car alone, late at night, no business being up here, delivered in the casual, conversational tone of someone describing the weather. Not a threat assessment, not professional instinct, just the private language of a man who had been making this particular calculation for 18 years and had never once been asked to justify it out loud. Then the stop. The 4 open windows unmistakable in the cruiser's forward camera, the dome light glowing warm inside the Buick, both of Jordan's hands visible at 10 and 2, clearly completely visible as hands can be. Jordan's voice on the audio announcing every motion before making it, asking permission, calm and precise and fully cooperative in every technical and human sense of the word. Then the explosion. The body cam footage shook violently as Greer lunged through the open window, and the audio captured the sound of Jordan hitting the asphalt, a sound that made one of the senior investigators close his eyes briefly and reopen them. The sound of something that should not have happened happening. The footage captured Jordan's voice, stating his compliance while pinned beneath 2 men. It captured Greer calling it resistance. It captured the high-pitched electrical discharge of the taser and the involuntary cry that followed. It captured Vance's strikes to the back of a boy's head, while that boy's palms were flat on the ground. Throughout the footage, Jordan's hands were visible, flat on the ground, open, never at any moment forming anything that any reasonable person watching it could describe even charitably as a threat. And then, the nod. One of the investigators stopped the footage and reversed it, brought it back to the moment before Vance called weapon. In the body cam angle visible over the roof of the car, the inclination of Greer's head was there brief minimal a fraction of a second, but completely clear. "That's premeditated escalation," the investigator said. "Yes," Raymond said. "It's conspiracy. Add it to the charges. I want civil rights violations under federal statute included conspiracy to deprive resulting in severe bodily injury." He looked at the SBI director. "Contact the FBI field office tonight." He paused. "Pull Greer's internal complaint file. Everything Lester has been closing for 11 years. All of it." The file arrived. 16 entries. 11 years. Every complaint signed closed by Captain Roy Lester. 3 of those complaints filed by individuals who later appeared as defendants in county court on charges that on review rested almost entirely on Greer's own testimony, with no corroborating evidence and no independent witnesses, people who had been processed through a system that had been quietly oriented around the protection of the officer rather than the accuracy of the outcome. The SBI director looked at the file for a long time, and then he said very quietly, "He has been running a private operation on these roads for over a decade." "Yes," Raymond said. "To people who had no one to call." He was quiet for a moment, and the footage was still up on the monitor, paused on a frame from the body cam. Jordan's hands flat on wet asphalt, both palms visible, open, unambiguous, and Raymond looked at it in the way you look at something that you have been preparing for and dreading in equal measure for a very long time. "Bring Greer to interrogation," he said. Greer had been sitting in the interrogation room for 26 minutes when the door opened, and in that time he had moved through the available positions with the systematic efficiency of a man working through a checklist. First, the residual defiance, the practiced posture of someone who has sat across from internal review investigators many times and walked out the other side with a clean record and a closed file. Then something colder and more honest as the specific preparation surrounding him, the seized servers the evidence drive pulled and secured the SBI agents processing his substation with the impersonal thoroughness of people who have done this before and have no stake in what they find accumulated into a picture he could not rearrange into anything comfortable. By the time Raymond came through the door, Greer was sweating, and the fine tremor in his hands cuffed to the steel ring on the table was something he could neither control nor conceal, and that he resented in a way that was almost as consuming as the fear itself. Raymond did not sit. He stood at the end of the table, opened a manila folder, a different manila envelope than the one in the Buick, but Greer noticed the material and looked away, and arranged a row of photographs on the table without speaking. High-resolution still frames from the body cam, each one, time-stamped each one, showing something different from what Greer's incident report described. The block capital handwriting on the envelope, visible in the glove compartment, clearly legible. Jordan's arms spread wide on wet asphalt, both palms open, completely flat. The taser pressed to the back of a boy's thigh while that boy lay motionless. The moment of the nod captured in a frame over the car's roofline, minimal but unmistakable. Raymond spoke quietly, so quietly that Greer had to hold himself still to hear it. And the quieter Raymond spoke, the more clearly Greer understood that things were worse than he had assessed. Raymond walked through the footage, point by point, what Jordan had done, what Greer had done, what the nod meant as a matter of law, what premeditated escalation meant in a federal civil rights context. Greer said he wanted his union representative. Raymond informed him that the union had been shown the footage at 1:07 a.m. They had declined representation. When they watched what Greer had done to a 19-year-old who had been compliant from the first moment the lights came on, they had made a business decision. Greer was entirely alone. Which is exactly as alone, Raymond said, as every person you targeted on this road for 18 years. The last structural support in Greer's posture gave way. Not dramatically, no outburst, no collapse, just a settling the particular mechanical failure of a building when the final load-bearing element goes the surface holding for one more moment, and then everything finding the ground. Raymond listed the charges, closed the folder, and walked to the door. Through the gap as it opened, Greer could see the hallway. Jordan was there, sitting in a chair along the wall with an SBI agent beside him waiting for transport to the hospital. Jordan was not looking at the interrogation room. He was looking straight ahead, his back straight already somewhere else in his mind, already moving forward. The door closed. In a smaller room down the corridor, federal prosecutor Dana Whitmore sat across from Scott Vance, who had his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. She had driven in from home and was running on 40 minutes of sleep and the particular sharpness that comes from a career built on not letting exhaustion affect precision. She slid a plea agreement across the table. "We know Greer was the architect," she said. "We know the nod is on camera. We know that what you were trained to do created the conditions for what happened." She folded her hands on the table. "None of that excuses what you did. You struck a compliant teenager twice in the back of the head while he was on the ground. You are facing 15 years in a federal facility." Vance looked at the document. Then he said, without strategy, without preamble, just the sound of something held under pressure for 4 hours. Finally finding the surface, I saw the envelope. I saw the word on it. I knew what it was, and I looked at him, and he nodded. Whitmore was quiet. "He is currently building a version of Tonight," she said, "in which your call of weapon was unauthorized and panicked. He is making you the origin point. The body cam contradicts him, but in a courtroom with the footage as context, his word against yours is a much cleaner case for the prosecution if you are sitting at the prosecution table rather than across from it. She pushed the agreement closer. 7 years full cooperation testimony against Greer and Lester, or 15 no deal and 6 months of Greer's attorneys making sure the jury's primary memory of this night is your face. Vance pulled the document across the table. He picked up the pen. His hand was steady in the particular way of hands that have made a decision they will not take back. He signed his name in one motion, set the pen down beside the paper, and sat back in his chair and looked at the wall. At 3:20 in the morning, Captain Roy Lester, at home in his kitchen and still believing he held some leverage, dialed a number from a burner phone he kept in the glove box of his personal car. He reached Pete Dunbar, or believed he did, and began to give specific instructions. Characterize Greer favorably. Contest the stop's timeline. Destroy the backup drive in the evidence archive. What Lester did not know was that Dunbar had been sitting for 50 minutes in an SBI mobile command unit parked 1 street from the substation, and that the phone he was speaking into was monitored, and that the SBI director's voice on the line identifying himself clearly by name and title was the last thing Lester heard before 3 unmarked vehicles converged on his address from separate directions. They found him in his kitchen, still holding the burner phone, wearing a bathrobe and 1 brown sock and 1 navy sock, and the expression of a man who spent 20 years building walls around himself and is only now understanding at 20 past 3 in the morning that walls require maintenance from the inside, too. 7 months passed. The oak trees on Granger Road went from bare through early bud, through the full heavy canopy of summer, and were beginning to shade toward autumn color when the trial of Dale Greer on 7 federal counts opened in the United States District Court. The courtroom smelled of mahogany and old paper, and the specific quality of air that circulates through spaces where consequences are formally rendered, and the federal seal behind the judge's bench carried the weight of something that does not accommodate local arrangements or departmental customs, or the quiet professional understandings that had kept a complaint file clean for 18 years. Jordan sat in the second row of the gallery in a navy suit he had bought with money from his work-study job. He was physically healed, the fractured jaw set clean, the ribs recovered after 8 weeks. The gash above his eye closed into a thin silver line, visible only in certain light. The kind of mark that a physician would call resolved, and that Jordan carried with the specific awareness of something that reminded him daily of the distance between what happened and what should have. He sat with the composed stillness of someone who has had 7 months to decide exactly how he intends to occupy this particular moment, and he had decided to occupy it with his full attention and nothing performative about his posture. Raymond sat beside him. Not as Attorney General, he had recused his office entirely and handed jurisdiction to the federal government on the night of the arrest, but as a father. He sat very still and very present. At the defense table, Dale Greer had undergone a transformation that no one who saw it could describe as subtle. The 18 years of accumulated authority that a uniform confers the physical grammar of a man who has never been made to answer for a decision was gone. What remained was someone who had lost weight in pre-trial detention, whose face had developed a grayish, slightly hollowed quality, whose shoulders carried the unfamiliar weight of being in a room where nobody was going to quietly close the file. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at Jordan. He had not looked at Jordan since the proceedings began. Scott Vance testified from the witness stand in his own detention facility clothing, which the prosecution had anticipated would be significant and proved to be more significant than anticipated. He testified for 3 hours. He described the culture Greer had built and transmitted the nod system the language of manufactured probable cause, the explicit vocabulary Greer used when he believed no one who mattered was listening. He testified that on Granger Road he had seen a registration envelope, and that he had known it was a registration envelope, and that he had looked at Dale Greer and received the nod, and that 8 months of conditioning had successfully replaced his own clear perception with the narrative that his trainer preferred. He wept on the stand. Not for effect, there was no calculation in it, but the specific involuntary weeping of someone accounting for a thing they cannot undo, making the accounting anyway, doing it in the only venue where it could do any good. The prosecution played the full body cam footage on a screen large enough that the jury could see every detail without leaning forward. Dana Whitmore played the audio at full volume. She played the entirety of the footage, including Greer's voice in the cruiser on the way back to the station. Private satisfied the voice of a man who believes the dark has kept it again. And when the footage ended, she stopped the recording and said nothing, because she had learned in 20 years that the most devastating summation of certain evidence is the refusal to summarize it. 3 members of the jury were visibly crying when the lights came back up. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 51 minutes, guilty on all 7 federal counts. Sentencing day drew more people than the trial had reporters from 2 national outlets, representatives from civil rights organizations, and a gallery filled with people who had driven various distances for reasons that were personal and specific and different in their details, but shared a common root, the particular need to be present for a moment when something that had been hidden is finally formally made visible. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Voss had been on the federal bench for 16 years and had a reputation among prosecutors and defense attorneys alike for sentences that were precise rather than theatrical, for the understanding that the weight of a sentence is determined by its accuracy, not its drama. She looked at Dale Greer over her reading glasses when the proceedings opened. Greer was already looking at the defense table's wood grain. He had not looked at the gallery. He had not looked at Jordan since the day he was walked out of the interrogation room. Before sentencing victim impact statement, Jordan Ellison. Jordan stood. He had no notes. He had written things down over 7 months, had read them back to himself, crossed them out, started again, produced several drafts that were technically accomplished and emotionally correct, and that he had ultimately decided were not what he needed to say, and had arrived at the understanding that what he needed to say was not something he required paper to hold. He walked to the podium. He gripped its edges. The room went quiet in the way that only happens when the person standing at the front of it has earned through specific and documented cost the right to be heard. He looked at Dale Greer. Greer looked back. He held it for approximately 2 seconds and then looked away. Jordan began. "Officer Greer," he said, and his voice carried the specific steadiness of water at depth. Not calm in the shallow sense, but possessing a pressure that comes from what is underneath it, from what is being held by it. "On the night you pulled me over on Granger Road, you made a decision about who I was before you had gathered a single piece of information about me. You decided from the distance of your headlights that I was a problem to be managed. And everything that followed, every blow, every false charge, every piece of fabricated paperwork, was downstream from that first decision. The decision that my presence on a road you had decided belonged to someone else was by itself a provocation." He paused, not for effect, but because what came next required something from him to say out loud. "My father is the Attorney General of this state. That is why I am standing in this courtroom and not in a state facility serving time for crimes I did not commit. I need everyone in this room to sit with that not as a success story, not as proof that the system worked, but as a mechanism. The accident of a phone number memorized at 13 years old. The specific unrepeatable circumstance of a father whose call you could not afford to ignore. That is the only variable between my story and the story of someone who went to prison instead of walking into this courtroom." He let it rest in the room for a moment. "There are others," he said, quieter now. "Boys on roads like Granger Road in counties like this one, with overworked public defenders and no resources and no one coming. I want you to understand, Officer Greer, not just what you did to me, but what you did to all of them. The ones whose names are not in this room. The ones whose registration envelopes were called weapons, whose compliance was called resistance, whose futures were taken apart in the dark by men who understood that the dark would keep it." He looked directly at Greer. You thought the dark would keep it this time, too. I want you to know I stood up. I finished my exams. I am still becoming the doctor I intend to be. I am standing here with my record clean and my hands open, and you are wearing a chain around your waist." He paused one final beat. "You did not break me. What I am less certain of is all the others, the ones you broke before you made the mistake of choosing me. That is the true weight of what you carry, not the sentence. That." He stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat. Raymond placed a hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Judge Voss waited. The room waited with her. Then she picked up her gavel. "Dale Greer." She said, "This court has reviewed the evidence, the body camera footage, and the 18-year record of this defendant's service, a record that includes 16 internal complaints closed without consequence. The court considers this not a validation of the defendant's conduct, but a failure of every supervisory structure that was supposed to constrain it. You operated without accountability for a very long time. That ends today." Count by count, the sentence was delivered consecutive terms on each federal count, totaling 26 years in a maximum security federal facility, no possibility of early parole. Greer's knees simply stopped performing their function. He didn't collapse dramatically. His legs gave way in the quiet mechanical way of a structure losing its last support, and he sagged sideways, his hands sliding across the polished surface of the defense table, and a sound came out of him that was not a word. Just the noise a person makes when the full arithmetic of what they have done arrives all at once, and there is nowhere left to put it. The two federal marshals who stepped forward were professional and not unkind about it. They helped him to his feet with practiced efficiency and walked him toward the rear holding door. As they moved him through the doorway, the chain at his waist caught briefly on the metal edge of the doorframe. The sound it made, one small, quiet metallic note, was very quiet in the large room, but the room was quiet enough that everyone heard it. Then he was gone. Captain Roy Lester, sentenced separately, received 10 years for his role in suppressing complaints, directing enforcement toward embedded patterns of bias, and his attempt to suborn evidence destruction on the night of the arrest. His municipal pension, 22 years of accumulation, was revoked in full, the funds directed toward civil damages paid to the individuals whose complaints he had buried. He wept during his own sentencing in the involuntary way of a man who did not know he was capable of weeping until the moment required it of him. Scott Vance received 5 years in a medium-security federal facility, reduced from 7 for his full cooperation and testimony that provided in an irony that was lost on no one. The single most comprehensive account available of how the Pembroke County Department had operated for nearly 2 decades, more complete than any internal investigation had managed in 18 years of not looking hard enough. If this story moved you, we hope you'll share it. Leave a comment below and subscribe to our channel. It's the best way to make sure stories like this one reach the people who need to hear them. The manila envelope Exhibit 14 in the federal case against Dale Greer sat sealed in a federal evidence archive in a building with fluorescent lights and no windows cataloged beside thousands of other objects that had been made into something other than what they were by a man with a badge and no one willing to hold him accountable. The block capital handwriting was still visible through the evidence bag. Registration/insurance. Written large and deliberate, written to be readable in bad light. Written by a man who had put it there so that even in the worst conditions what it contained would be unmistakable. It had been unmistakable. It had not mattered until it did. The broken signal light at the Granger-Whitfield intersection was finally repaired in November, 6 weeks after the verdict, after the county and the township resolved the question of who bore responsibility for its maintenance. It blinked steady amber now, which was almost the same as fixed, but on certain nights when a car rolled south on Granger Road and slowed at the intersection, and the amber light fell across the driver's face through the window. The light seemed to hold for just a moment longer than its programming required, as though something in the road had learned slowly and at significant cost to pause before deciding what it was looking at. Jordan Ellison passed his biochemistry exam with an 88. He kept the anatomy textbook. He kept the blue latex surgical glove tucked between the pages as a bookmark where it had been since the night he drove home from the clinic along a familiar road thinking about exams and leftovers and nothing else. He still volunteers twice a week at the East Side Community Health Clinic. He still drives his Uncle Bernard's Buick. The check engine light remains pending a matter Bernard has been meaning to address for somewhere between 1 and 2 years now, depending on who is telling the story. Jordan still believes with a conviction that sometimes surprises even him in its completeness, that medicine is only meaningful if it reaches the people who cannot reach it on their own. He intends completely and without reservation to become that doctor.